atmosphere at the ultra-exclusive VIP event was charged with anticipation, a glittering sea of billionaires, entrepreneurs, and celebrities. Yet, when the door swung open and in walked a man wearing a MAGA hat, the entire room seemed to freeze. Conversations faltered, champagne flutes hovered mid-air, all eyes turned toward him, scanning him up and down. The man didn't look like anyone important. In fact, he was dressed in a plain hoodie and jeans, far from the tailored suits and designer gowns surrounding him. The room buzzed with quiet whispers as people tried to make sense of this unexpected intrusion. The security team exchanged glances, their brows furrowing. Was this person allowed in? Who was he? No one knew it yet, but this unassuming figure was about to shake up the event in a way no one could have ever predicted. His presence would stir up more than just questions. What happened next would leave everyone speechless. The event took place in one of the most luxurious venues in the city, a private, invitation-only gala designed to bring together the most powerful figures in tech, business, and entertainment. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a soft glow on the marble floors, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and gourmet food. It was a night meant to be filled with high-profile networking and deep-pocketed discussions, where the biggest names rubbed elbows in a carefully curated, polished atmosphere. Guests were decked out in exclusive designer outfits, with every detail of their appearance meticulously crafted to exude power and wealth. Security was tight, with private guards positioned at every corner, ensuring no one without an invitation even came close to the entrance. This was a world of sophistication and elegance, a world where even the slightest misstep could ruin reputations. Everything was perfect, until the man in the MAGA hat walked in. Elon Musk didn't fit the mold of the typical VIP guest at such an event. He wasn't dressed in an immaculate tuxedo or a sharp business suit. Instead, he wore a casual hoodie, some jeans, and, of course, a red MAGA hat, the emblem of a controversial movement that had polarized the nation. The irony was not lost on him. He wasn't there to make a political statement. No, Elon was simply curious. He had received an invite from a friend, someone influential in the tech world, and decided to see for himself what all the fuss was about. But his casual attire, coupled with the bold hat, immediately set him apart from the sea of perfectly polished attendees. As Elon walked into the room, no one recognized him. The staff glanced up at him with a mix of confusion and suspicion. Who was this man? What was he doing here? For a moment, he blended into the background, just another face in the crowd. But that was about to change. The moment security saw him, their instincts kicked in. The man in the MAGA hat didn't belong. He didn't have the look of someone who was supposed to be here. The guards exchanged subtle, concerned glances, but none of them approached immediately. They weren't sure who he was, and for a moment, no one wanted to take the risk of making a scene. Meanwhile, the other guests, who had been casually mingling, now turned their attention toward him. Their reactions ranged from disinterest to outright judgment. A few whispered to each other, pointing at the unfamiliar figure with their eyes. They couldn't understand why someone so out of place had been allowed in. Elon, now aware of the attention on him, stood still for a moment. He could feel the cold stares of the elite guests and the chill from their whispered comments. He had been in enough high-profile situations to know how quickly people could turn their noses up at someone who didn't fit the mold. But he wasn't here to make waves. He didn't care about their judgment. He was simply observing, seeing if this world lived up to the hype. But as the tension in the room mounted, something inside Elon stirred. The coldness from the crowd, the subtle but unmistakable looks of disapproval, made him feel like an outsider. Was this what the elite world was like? Judgment, exclusivity, and exclusion based on how someone looked? Elon continued to walk through the room, undeterred, but he could feel eyes on him, watching his every move. The staff behind the scenes were still talking, growing more uncomfortable by the second. Their concern had shifted from suspicion to caution. They had to figure out what to do with this man, this mystery guest who had somehow slipped past them. As Elon reached the center of the room, he overheard a whispered conversation between two staff members. One was the event coordinator, and the other was a senior security guard. The words were almost too quiet to hear, but Elon caught snippets. "Who's he? Should we ask him to leave? He's definitely not supposed to be here." A brief flash of irritation flickered in Elon's chest. He wasn't there to cause trouble. He wasn't even there to make a statement. Yet, here he was, being treated as though he were a misfit. He adjusted his MAGA hat, the symbol now more symbolic than ever, and took another step forward, deeper into the event. At that moment, he realized something important. He wasn't just a person in the crowd anymore. He was about to challenge everything this event stood for. But the question was, did anyone even know who he truly was? The mood in the room shifted from curiosity to unease as the whispers about the man in the MAGA hat spread like wildfire. What started as hushed conversations grew louder, the tension palpable. Security, trained to spot potential disruptions, was quick to notice Elon. Their suspicion wasn't based on who he was, but purely on the MAGA hat, a symbol that had long been associated with controversy and conflict. One of the security guards, a tall, muscular man with a serious expression, whispered to his colleague, "We can't let someone like that in here." His tone was sharp, full of disapproval. His colleague nodded and gave Elon a once-over, narrowing his eyes. "It's probably best we handle this before it escalates," the second guard muttered, his hand subtly resting on his earpiece. The guards weren't about to take any chances, especially in a room filled with VIPs whose safety they were responsible for. But instead of addressing Elon directly, they began to circle around him, discussing their next steps in muted tones, casting furtive glances in his direction. Their behavior was telling. Their focus on the hat, rather than on the man himself, made it clear they weren't concerned about the individual, but about the potential disruption that could arise from his presence. Despite their whispers, Elon remained calm. He could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't in a hurry, wasn't seeking attention, and wasn't about to let their judgment influence his choices. But the unease was spreading. The staff, who had been smiling and laughing just moments ago, began to stiffen as they noticed the security guards' reactions. The hum of conversation began to quiet down as more and more people took notice of the intruder in their midst, the man in the MAGA hat. The event's host, a well-known tech mogul who had invited some of the brightest minds in the business world, was across the room when the disturbance began. He caught sight of the growing commotion and saw the whispers, the subtle glances, and the questioning looks from both his guests and the staff. His first instinct was to dismiss it, to chalk it up to an overzealous security team. But as the whispers grew louder, his own curiosity was piqued. He turned to one of his staff members, a woman in her 30s with a no-nonsense attitude, who had been organizing the event all night. "What's going on over there?" he asked, motioning to where Elon stood, still unnoticed by most of the guests. The woman's gaze followed his, and she narrowed her eyes when she saw the MAGA hat. "I'll go take care of it," she replied, her voice laced with concern. She wasn't sure what exactly was happening, but the last thing the host needed was an interruption at his carefully curated event. As she approached, the chatter in the room seemed to pause, as though the guests were holding their breath. She made her way toward Elon, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor, a clear signal of her approach. There was no time to waste. The staff had been instructed to ensure the event went off without a hitch, and any disturbance could reflect poorly on the host. Her steps were purposeful, but her expression remained neutral, her eyes scanning the crowd as she finally reached Elon. Standing before Elon, she took a moment to size him up. Despite the casualness of his outfit, there was something in his demeanor that made her pause. There was a quiet confidence about him, a self-assuredness that suggested he wasn't just anyone. But the hat, oh, the hat. It stood out like a sore thumb in the midst of polished luxury and exclusivity. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone professional but cool. "Could you please remove your hat?" Elon raised an eyebrow, taken aback by the request. He hadn't expected to be treated like this at all. Not in a room filled with people who prided themselves on their progressive ideals and freedom of expression. But the request itself wasn't what surprised him. It was the underlying assumption that the hat was the problem. He glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. "I'm sorry. I'm not removing my hat," he replied calmly, his voice steady but firm. "I have the right to wear whatever I choose." The woman was momentarily taken aback. She had been prepared for an apology or for him to comply with her request, as most people in the room would have. But instead, Elon's response was unyielding. She blinked, her voice becoming more insistent. "Sir, I understand your right to express yourself," she said, her eyes flickering to the hat again. "But this is a very exclusive event, and we have a certain atmosphere here. It would be best if you could respect the guidelines." The room seemed to grow quieter as the exchange continued. Guests who had been eyeing Elon from a distance now turned their attention to the two of them. The security guards had started to move closer, as though anticipating trouble. But Elon's cool demeanor was far from confrontational. Elon smiled slightly, though there was no humor in his eyes. "This isn't about politics," he said, his voice calm but with a sharpness that indicated his resolve. "It's about personal freedom, about the right to express myself however I choose. I'm not here to make a statement. I'm here to observe, to enjoy the event, just like everyone else. But I will not remove my hat." The tension in the room thickened, and the woman's face flushed with frustration. She had been given a job to do, and here was this man, this uninvited guest, refusing to follow the rules. How dare he? But something in Elon's tone made her pause. He wasn't angry. He wasn't being combative. He was simply standing his ground, a quiet defiance in the face of an unnecessary request. Around them, the guests continued to watch in silence, as though holding their breath. The security guards, no longer sure of how to handle the situation, hovered on the edge of the crowd, ready to intervene if necessary. For a moment, Elon locked eyes with the woman. His calmness seemed to unsettle her even more, the uncertainty of how to proceed now reflecting in her own expression. Should she call for backup? Should she escalate the situation further? The eyes of the entire room were on them now, making her feel even more out of place, like a pawn in a game she didn't understand. "Fine," she finally said, her voice tight with restraint. "But just know that your actions are causing quite a stir." Elon nodded politely. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, but I won't apologize for being myself." And with that, he turned away from her, his presence still commanding attention. The staff member stood there, momentarily stunned. She hadn't expected resistance, let alone calm defiance. The tension didn't dissolve. If anything, it only grew as the room now hummed with murmurs and sidelong glances. The situation had escalated, but no one could quite understand why. Elon didn't care. He wasn't there to please anyone. He wasn't there to fit into the mold. He was there for one reason, to experience the event. And he wasn't going to let anyone make him feel less than welcome, no matter what they thought of his hat. As Elon stood there, quietly holding his ground, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. The guests were no longer just whispering. They were watching, eyes wide with curiosity and suspicion. The air had thickened with tension, and it felt as though every person in the room was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. The security guards, who had been lingering around the perimeter, now seemed to be on high alert. They exchanged quick glances, silently communicating. Their focus had narrowed on Elon, and there was no doubt in their minds that this situation could no longer be ignored. They couldn't afford to let things spiral out of control at such a high-profile event. "Sir," one of the security guards said, stepping forward. His voice was firm, but controlled. "We're going to have to ask you to take off the hat, or we'll have to escort you out." Elon's calm gaze shifted to the guard, but there was no anger in his eyes, just a quiet determination. "I've already explained why I'm wearing it," he replied, his voice steady but tinged with a sense of frustration that was beginning to creep in. "This isn't about politics. It's just a hat." The guard's expression didn't change, but the tension in his stance was noticeable. "We understand, sir," the guard said, glancing around at his colleagues. "But the event's host has made it clear that this kind of attention is disrupting the event. If you refuse, we'll have to ask you to leave." Elon's heart sank a little as he realized the gravity of the situation. He had come to the event not to cause problems, but to be part of the crowd, to observe, to understand the people who gathered in such rarefied spaces. But now, all he was being judged for was the hat on his head. The thought stung, and for a brief moment, he felt the sharp sting of injustice. A familiar feeling for anyone who had ever been judged based on appearance or assumptions. Taking a slow breath, Elon glanced around the room. His eyes met those of a few of the guests who had been watching. Some of them looked away quickly, perhaps feeling uncomfortable with the confrontation. Others exchanged looks with their friends, unsure of what to make of the situation. Elon had never cared much for the opinions of others, but this was different. This wasn't just a simple interaction. This was about his right to be there without being scrutinized for something as trivial as a hat. He turned back to the security guard. "I'm not here to cause any trouble," Elon said, his tone softer now. "I just want to enjoy the event. Can I speak to the host? Maybe there's been a misunderstanding." The guard's expression remained unchanged. "The host has already made his decision, sir. If you won't remove the hat, you'll have to leave." At that moment, Elon knew that this wasn't just about a hat. It was about something deeper, something more insidious: judgment. He had been categorized the moment he walked in, simply because of the way he looked, because of the symbol on his head. The feeling of being marginalized for something so insignificant stirred a sense of frustration inside him, but instead of lashing out, he remained composed. From across the room, the event host, a man in his late 50s with a reputation for his wealth and social influence, had been watching the interaction unfold. His expression was initially one of polite indifference, but it quickly shifted to one of concern as the situation escalated. He had invited a select group of individuals to this exclusive event, and now he was faced with an unexpected complication, a disturbance that could tarnish the carefully curated image of the evening. The host made his way over to the scene, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. As he approached, he could see the faces of the security guards, serious, unwavering, and Elon standing calmly in front of them. The tension in the air was thick, almost unbearable. The host's eyes flicked to Elon's MAGA hat, and it only took a moment for him to understand what was happening. "Excuse me," the host said, his voice cutting through the air. "What's the issue here?" The security guard who had been speaking to Elon turned to the host, explaining the situation. "This gentleman is refusing to remove his hat. We've asked him multiple times and it's causing a disruption. We feel it's best if he leaves, sir." Elon looked at the host who was now standing before him. The man's face was a mask of politeness, but his eyes betrayed an underlying discomfort. He was trying to manage the situation with as much grace as possible, but Elon could sense the hesitation in his tone. The host cleared his throat. "I understand, but we need to maintain the image of this event. This isn't about personal rights. It's about the greater good of the evening." He paused, glancing at the guests around him. "We can escort you out if you don't wish to comply." Elon's mind raced, but he didn't let his frustration show. He had been through plenty of high-pressure situations, but this was different. The host wasn't trying to understand him as an individual. He was merely concerned about the optics, the appearance of what was happening, not the reality of it. "You can escort me out if you want," Elon said calmly. "But I want to be clear, I'm not causing any trouble here. I'm just being myself. If that's a problem, then maybe I don't belong here after all." The host hesitated, and for a moment, Elon could see a flicker of doubt in his eyes, but it passed quickly and he quickly masked it with a forced smile. "It's not about you personally, Mr. Musk," he said, almost apologetically. "It's just about the event and keeping things smooth." Elon nodded, his patience thinning. It was becoming clear that this was never about who he was. It was about the image he was creating with his hat, a symbol that some found distasteful. And it was that judgment, that quick dismissal, that gnawed at him the most. As Elon stood there, waiting for the inevitable escort, his frustration grew. He could feel the eyes of the room on him, the silent judgment coming from every direction. The whole situation was ridiculous. He had been judged not by who he was, but by a symbol he chose to wear. The more he thought about it, the more the whole thing seemed absurd. Here he was, one of the most innovative and successful entrepreneurs in the world, and yet the only thing people cared about was the hat he was wearing. It didn't matter that he was responsible for groundbreaking companies, that he had revolutionized entire industries. None of that seemed to matter in the face of the MAGA hat. To them, he was just a symbol of division, a target for their anger and judgment. As security moved closer, Elon's thoughts turned inward. He wondered how many others in the room had experienced something similar. How many people had been dismissed or discriminated against simply because of the way they looked or the symbols they wore? How many times had people been unfairly judged, their value overlooked, simply because of the way they expressed themselves? His frustration turned to reflection. He had known that this kind of judgment existed, but being treated like an outsider because of a piece of clothing made it all too real. He wasn't the first person to face this kind of treatment, and he certainly wouldn't be the last. But that didn't make it any easier to bear. In the face of it all, Elon remained calm, but inside, he felt a burning need to expose the hypocrisy. The way people allowed their assumptions to guide their actions, the way they let symbols define people. He didn't want to make a scene. He didn't want to escalate the situation. But the injustice of it all felt suffocating. The situation was escalating. There was no going back now. The tension in the room had reached a breaking point. Every eye was trained on Elon Musk, but there was an underlying tension, a murmur of disbelief hanging in the air. The security guards stood in a semicircle around him, their stances rigid, unwavering. The host looked like he was preparing for a difficult decision, but there was no way out now. "Sir, I'm afraid we really must ask you to leave," the host repeated, his voice slightly more forceful now. There was no sign of apology in his tone, just the cold professionalism of someone determined to maintain control of a situation spiraling out of hand. Elon glanced around the room. The guests, most of whom had been watching the confrontation with growing interest, were now whispering among themselves, exchanging glances, some with a faint look of pity, others with barely concealed amusement. Some didn't even bother to hide their disapproval. Elon's eyes, however, were steady. He had been in difficult situations before. He had been scrutinized, criticized, misunderstood. But this was different. He wasn't just being judged by his actions or his words. He was being judged by something as trivial as a hat that had come to symbolize so much more than its mere fabric. At that moment, Elon had a choice to make. He could comply, walk out, and let the judgment stand. Let it be a simple misunderstanding, an incident that would fade from the memory of the event's attendees. Or he could reveal his true identity, force them to see the truth, and expose the deep hypocrisy of this situation. He knew that revealing himself would not only change the course of this night, but could perhaps make a statement that might resonate far beyond these walls. For a brief moment, The thought of walking away quietly crossed his mind. It would be easy. Just walk out the door, head held high, and let the world continue on as it was. But something about the way he had been treated, something about the unfairness of it all, gnawed at him. He had always prided himself on standing up for what he believed in, even when the odds were stacked against him. And here, in front of a room full of the world's most powerful people, he realized that his silence would be complicity in a system that judged others without knowing who they were. Elon took a deep breath. He wasn't just going to let it go. Without a hint of hesitation, Elon turned slowly toward the host. The room fell quiet, as if holding its breath. The murmurs stopped. Even the security guards paused, their eyes flicking between the host and Elon. They didn't know what was coming, but they sensed something was about to shift. "I'm Elon Musk," he said, his voice calm yet firm, carrying the weight of a truth that no one had expected. The words hung in the air, thick with the shock that would soon follow. For a long moment, no one moved. The silence in the room was deafening. Guests exchanged glances, confusion written on their faces. The host's expression faltered, his polite smile vanishing as disbelief crept into his features. A few seconds passed, and then another. A security guard, still unsure of how to process what he'd just heard, looked Elon over once more, this time with renewed scrutiny. He had no idea whether this was a prank or whether Elon was actually who he said he was. The uncertainty was written all over his face. The host, looking more flustered by the second, fumbled with his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen as he quickly typed Elon's name into a search engine. The seconds ticked by, stretching into what felt like an eternity. Finally, the host looked up from his phone, his face blanching as the result of his search came up. Elon Musk, CEO of Tesla, SpaceX, and one of the wealthiest men in the world. A stunned silence followed. No one spoke. No one moved. The shock rippled through the crowd. The moment of truth had arrived, and no one quite knew how to react. "Is this really him?" one of the guests whispered under their breath, his voice barely audible but carrying the weight of disbelief. A few others nodded in stunned silence, as if waiting for confirmation. The room was suddenly alive with gasps, sharp intakes of breath, and murmurs of shock. One guest in the back of the room leaned toward their companion, their eyes wide. "Elon Musk? The Tesla guy? No way, he's just wearing a MAGA hat. That can't be him. This is a joke, right?" Another guest said, more to themselves than to anyone else. But the host, now fully aware of the reality, stepped back, his face flushing with embarrassment. His demeanor was no longer cold and professional. It was apologetic, defensive, and slightly panicked. He had made a decision, and in an instant, everything had changed. The room seemed to hold its breath as Elon stood there, watching the reactions unfold. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but the collective shock of the crowd was almost palpable. Some guests seemed to have trouble processing the fact that they had been dismissing one of the most influential people in the world based solely on his appearance. It was a hard pill to swallow. The truth that the judgment they had passed on Elon was not just wrong, but humiliating. The security guards, who had been so certain of their actions moments before, now looked uncertain. They exchanged confused looks with each other. How could they have made such an enormous mistake? How could they have not recognized the man standing before them, the one who had fundamentally reshaped entire industries, sent rockets into space, and revolutionized electric vehicles? It was almost laughable, but the gravity of the situation hung in the air. Elon stood still, watching as the realization dawned on the crowd. A few guests exchanged uneasy glances. Some appeared embarrassed, their eyes downcast. Others seemed to have no idea how to process what had just happened. But one thing was clear: the room's perception of Elon had shifted completely. The man they had dismissed for his hat was now being seen for who he truly was: Elon Musk, a titan of the tech world, a visionary and a billionaire. The host, still flustered, began to stammer out an apology. "Mr. Musk, I had no idea, But before he could finish, Elon held up his hand, signaling for him to stop. "It's all right," Elon said, his voice calm. "No need to apologize, you've just learned something important." His words carried an air of quiet authority, but there was no anger in them. Instead, they were tinged with something more profound, an invitation for self-reflection. The guests in the room, still processing what had just unfolded, fell into an uneasy silence. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a silence that said, "This could have been any one of us." The realization that had slowly been creeping into the room hit everyone all at once. The staff, who had been so sure of their actions only moments before, now stood frozen in place, as if struck by a collective wave of regret. The security guard, the first to confront Elon Musk, was visibly shaken. His hand instinctively reached up to touch his earpiece, as though trying to reassure himself that the events unfolding before him were real, not some bizarre nightmare. But there was no denying it. The man he had just forced to leave, the one he had judged solely based on a red hat, was Elon Musk. His heart raced as he looked around, eyes darting between his colleagues, the host, and Elon. There was a hollow feeling in his chest, a sense of deep discomfort that grew with every passing second. He had made a huge mistake, and the weight of that realization sat heavily on him. Beside him, the host's face had drained of all color. He was no longer the calm, authoritative figure he had been moments before. Now, his features were pale, his jaw tight with a mixture of embarrassment and guilt. He had acted impulsively. His initial instinct to protect the event's image had led him to dismiss someone without even a second thought. And now, in front of everyone, he realized the gravity of his error. The tension in the room was palpable. There was an awkward pause as the staff exchanged uneasy glances, each person trying to figure out what to say, how to address the situation they had so badly mishandled. The air felt thick with regret. And then, as if on cue, the apologies began. I'm so sorry, Mr. Musk," the host stammered, his voice faltering as he took a small step toward Elon. We didn't know. Please forgive us for the misunderstanding." Elon didn't immediately respond. His calmness was almost unsettling in contrast to the chaos around him. He stood silently, waiting, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. He wasn't angry, he wasn't offended. He just waited for the staff to process what had happened. The silence stretched on, each apology from the host and security guards feeling increasingly hollow, like words that had been hastily thrown together to fill the awkward void. A young assistant, her face flushed with embarrassment, stepped forward cautiously. Her eyes were wide with regret as she addressed Elon, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Musk. We should have treated you with respect from the beginning. It was wrong of us." There was a momentary pause before Elon responded. His expression remained unchanged, still composed, still calm. But something about the way he regarded the assistant softened the air in the room. He nodded, acknowledging her apology, but his words were measured, thoughtful. "It's not about me," Elon said simply. "It's about how we treat each other. It's about respect. No one should be judged based on what they wear, or how they look, or the things they believe in. We all deserve to be treated with dignity no matter our background or our opinions." The staff was silent, absorbing his words, and for a moment it felt like the room had been struck by a collective realization, a shift in perspective. The tension that had gripped the group moments before seemed to dissolve, replaced by something heavier: guilt. They hadn't just made a mistake. They had failed to see the humanity of the person standing in front of them. A failure that went beyond a simple misjudgment. It was a failure to treat someone as a person, not as a symbol or a stereotype. Through it all, Elon remained calm, almost serene. His demeanor had never changed. He wasn't here to create chaos or to make anyone feel bad. He was here because, in his quiet, unassuming way, he wanted to send a message, one that wasn't about his status, his wealth, or his fame. It was about how we view each other, how we let superficial things cloud our judgment. As the host and the staff continued to express their regret, Elon listened patiently, nodding occasionally. His presence was composed, not stern or accusing, but there was a gravity to his words that could not be ignored. He wasn't making this about himself. This wasn't about the man who had built an empire of rockets and electric cars. This was about the treatment of all people, regardless of what they wore or the labels others placed on them. "I didn't come here to cause trouble," Elon continued, his voice steady but firm. "I came here because I wanted to see how I would be treated, just like anyone else. And the sad part is that this is something that happens all the time, to people who don't have the same resources, the same power. Every day, people are judged on the way they look, or what they wear, or where they're from. It's easy to dismiss someone when they don't fit the mold." He paused, his eyes scanning the faces of the staff, who were now listening intently, absorbing every word. "You all are good people, I'm sure. But the truth is, we all carry our biases, whether we realize it or not. And when we judge others based on those biases, we miss the chance to see them for who they truly are. I don't care about the hat. I care about how you treat me, how you treat everyone." The words hung in the air, almost too simple to fully grasp, but undeniable in their power. Elon's voice didn't rise in anger, nor did he scold the staff. He didn't need to. The lesson had already been delivered in the quiet, thoughtful way he had handled the entire situation. The silence that followed was heavy. The staff stood in place, processing Elon's words. The assistant, who had been the first to apologize, stood back, her eyes welling with tears. It was clear she understood the deeper meaning of Elon's message. She had come to the painful realization that she, too, had been guilty of rushing to judgment, of letting superficial appearances dictate her treatment of others. Now, standing in front of the man she had unwittingly dismissed, the lesson was not just intellectual, it was emotional. "I'm sorry," the assistant whispered again, this time more sincerely. "I've learned so much from this. I'll never forget this moment." Elon nodded, his eyes softening. "It's all right," he said. "It's about learning, not about being perfect. We all make mistakes. What matters is how we grow from them." The host, who had been standing in stunned silence, took a deep breath. It was clear that he too had learned something profound from this encounter. His face was no longer flushed with embarrassment, but now had a somber look of introspection. He had allowed his assumptions and his desire to maintain the event's image to cloud his judgment, and in doing so, he had made a mistake, one that could not be undone. But it was a mistake that he could learn from. "I'll make sure something like this never happens again," the host said quietly. "We'll do better. We'll all do better." Elon smiled softly. That's all anyone can ask for. In that moment, as the weight of the situation began to lift, there was a sense of resolution, a quiet understanding that the event had not been about the hat or the politics behind it. It had been about something far more important: respect, humanity, and the willingness to see others for who they truly are, rather than what they appear to be on the surface. And for everyone in that room, the lesson had been learned. As the event continued to hum in the background, the moment of revelation had left a lingering silence hanging in the air. Despite the apologies and reassurances that followed, Elon Musk had already made his decision. He wasn't here to engage in further drama, nor was he interested in drawing attention to the irony of the situation. He simply wanted to show the room the impact of their actions, and with his identity now known, his message had been delivered loud and clear. Without raising his voice, without any fanfare, Elon turned on his heel and made his way towards the exit. His departure was quiet, dignified, and unassuming, a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted moments earlier. He didn't need to make a scene, his mere presence had already caused enough of an upheaval. As he walked past the bewildered staff and guests, many of whom were now too stunned to speak, there was a profound sense of regret that filled the room. The security guards who had been so quick to act moments ago stood frozen, their eyes following Elon as he left. The host, who had been the one to decide to escort Elon out, stood with a look of shame on their face. They knew they had just lost the opportunity to genuinely engage with one of the most influential figures in the world, all because of a snap judgment based on a hat. The guests who had witnessed the entire exchange now sat in stunned silence, their conversations muted. Some of them exchanged uncomfortable glances, realizing how quickly they had all allowed their assumptions to cloud their judgment. There was no denying it. Elon Musk had been judged and dismissed solely based on his outward appearance, and the consequences of that mistake were now painfully clear. Elon's exit didn't cause a scene, but the absence of his presence in the room spoke volumes. The guests slowly began to return to their conversations, but there was a sense that something had shifted. The atmosphere, once full of exclusivity and pride, now felt uncomfortable and tense. The illusion of superiority had been shattered, and no one in that room could escape the quiet discomfort of knowing they had been part of a mistake, one that could have been avoided with a little more open-mindedness and respect. Later that evening, as the event began to wind down, the host found themselves alone in a quiet corner of the venue. The events of the past hour replayed in their mind like a loop. Elon walking in, the whispers, the confrontation with security, and the eventual revelation of his identity. The gravity of their decision to judge Elon Musk based solely on a MAGA hat weighed heavily on them. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a reflection of their own biases, something they hadn't even realized they were carrying until now. The host had prided themselves on hosting the most exclusive events, gathering the richest and most powerful people in the world under one roof. They had always believed that their ability to curate an impeccable guest list and maintain the image of the event was the most important thing. But now, in the quiet aftermath of what had transpired, they saw how flawed that thinking was. They had allowed their desire to maintain the event's elite image to cloud their judgment of Elon Musk, a man who had helped reshape the world in ways they could never fathom. And for what? Because of a hat. Because of an outward symbol that didn't define the man beneath it. As the host sat, their mind began to turn over the choices they had made that evening. It became increasingly clear that their initial instinct to remove Elon was not just a poor decision. It was a reflection of a deeper, more pervasive issue, the tendency to judge others based on external factors rather than their true character. It wasn't just about Elon or his hat. It was about a culture of exclusion, of allowing appearances to dictate how people were treated. The host couldn't shake the feeling of remorse. They had been in the room with one of the most innovative minds of their generation, someone who had built entire companies that had changed the world, and yet they had treated him like an outsider simply because of a political symbol. The host had failed to recognize the humanity of the person standing before them. They had failed to see beyond the superficial to the person who was quietly observing, patiently waiting to see how he would be treated. And now that realization sat heavy in their chest. That night, the host made a promise to themselves, a promise that the event would never be the same again. They would not allow judgment based on appearances to dictate the treatment of any guest in the future, no matter their background, their beliefs, or the symbols they wore. The host decided to address the guests and staff the following day, publicly acknowledging their mistake and making a commitment to be more inclusive moving forward. The future of the event and their own personal actions would be shaped by the lesson they had just learned. The impact was far-reaching. guests began to notice the difference in the way they were treated. There was a new openness in the air. Conversations flowed more easily, and people felt less inclined to judge based on appearances. In the following months, the event became known not only for its exclusivity, but also for its inclusivity. People from all walks of life felt comfortable attending, knowing they would be treated with the respect they deserved. Several months later, a familiar face returned to the VIP event, Elon Musk. This time, however, there was no tension, no whispers, no security guard hovering in the background. Elon walked into the venue once again, but this time, he was greeted with warmth and respect from everyone around him. The host, aware of the past mistakes, personally approached Elon as he entered, offering a heartfelt apology for what had happened previously. "I want to sincerely apologize for what occurred last time," the host said. "It was wrong, and it should never have happened. You should have been treated with the utmost respect from the start." Elon, who had always been known for his calm demeanor and composed nature, simply nodded and smiled. "No harm done. I understand how these things happen," he replied, his tone sincere but forgiving. It was clear that the past incident hadn't left him bitter, but the event's willingness to change had left a lasting impression on him. The staff, who had once been part of the judgmental crowd, now welcomed Elon with open arms. They greeted him by name, offering him a drink and engaging in casual conversation. There was no sign of hesitation or discomfort. It was as if the events of the past had never happened, replaced by a new culture of respect and understanding. The noticeable shift in the event's culture didn't go unnoticed. Guests who had been present during the original incident now observed the change with a sense of relief and approval. They could see that the event had transformed. No longer was it a place where appearances determined respect. Instead, it had become a venue where individuals could come together, share ideas, and engage with one another on equal footing, regardless of their background or what they wore. As the evening progressed, Elon mingled with the other guests, enjoying the event as any other attendee would. He seemed genuinely at ease, and for the first time, he wasn't just Elon Musk, the billionaire entrepreneur. He was simply a person among others, treated with the same courtesy and respect as anyone else. By the end of the night, the host approached him once more, this time with a sincere thank you. "Thank you for giving us a second chance," they said. "Your presence here tonight means a lot to us. We've learned a lot from you, more than you may realize." Elon's response was simple yet profound. "I believe in second chances and I believe in growth. You've all shown that you can change, and that's what matters." As Elon Musk left the event that night, there was no fanfare, no dramatic exit, just a quiet departure, leaving behind a room full of people who had learned an important lesson, not just from him, but about themselves. The change that had begun with one simple incident had now become a part of the event's identity. No longer was it a place defined by exclusivity or judgment. It was a place where people could be themselves, free from the biases and assumptions that had once plagued it. And as the event continued to grow and evolve, the organizers knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where respect, understanding, and inclusivity would always come first.